Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. The year is winding down. People are getting ready for a holiday break, but a big issue for our state in the new year is really coming into focus, and that's education, especially creating a stronger school system in the city of Detroit. A new coalition of prominent Detroiters is taking on the task of improving schools. The governor says he is formulating ideas as well. Will it mean the end of emergency managers for the district? We'll explore that coming up. Plus, the final bill is due in Detroit's bankruptcy. Is the cost reasonable? Also, it's down to the wire for road funding as legislators get ready to call it quits for 2014. And two Michigan political leaders say goodbye after 94 years of service. That is all coming up for you on MiWeek. But we do begin with a new attempt to improve Detroit schools. A coalition of 31 city leaders will make recommendations on school reform. The group will focus on public, charter, and Education Achievement Authority schools. And among the issues to be tackled, huge deficits, shrinking enrollment, and poor test scores. Governor Snyder also wants to have broad reforms in place by the second half of next year. Plus, he has to decide what's next for Detroit Public Schools after emergency manager Jack Martin leaves in January. We will start our discussion there with our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's always good to see you, and I'm glad we're starting with education this week because I do think it's going to be one of the biggest issues that we're going to face in 2015. And I like the idea of this coalition, 31 people, and they're representing all different kinds of organizations from Skillman, NAACP, the Detroit Regional Chamber, a principal, a former emergency manager of Detroit schools. It's quite a large list. But so when you looked at it, did you say anyone was left off of that list? Is there anyone else that should be included there? Let me start with you, Nolan, I guess.
No, I mean, it's pretty broad. There's public, there's charter, and people are coming from all different places. I mean, it's one of two or three groups that have sort of morphed together, and there's been a lot of talk over the last year or two about what to do with the Detroit schools. Some kind of decision is going to have to be made because the term of the emergency manager ends, I think, in January, and the governor's got to decide, is he going to do this one more time? It hasn't been all that effective. He hasn't accomplished what he wants. I know he's frustrated with it, so he needs some ideas, and he needs them quickly if this is going to, if we're actually going to see some progress in Detroit schools.
Is this the right mix of people, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it probably is. It may be too many. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the super committee idea of actually solving problems. I think it's a little easier if you have a little tighter group that's more focused on an actual solution.
You know what? Actually, that was my actual concern when I saw the number of people on the list and saw. Are they coming from all of a bunch of different agendas? Is it going to be hard to merge those agendas together?
Yeah, there's no question about that. There'll be a lot of different ideas in the room and a lot of people with different interests that they're representing. So this all sort of unfolds, though, against a backdrop of the mayor and the governor having been talking about this for some time, and I think they were pretty close to a solution, not just to the public schools in Detroit, but also the charter schools would have been part of it, and the EAA would have been part of it, which is where we need to be headed. We need to be headed toward a system of schools in the city that's all sort of managed under one system of accountability and under, you know, sort of the same authority. I think this group is sort of an answer to that, saying to the mayor and the governor, you need to include the community a little more. There are interests that are sort of left out of that. So I don't know how that all ends up playing out.
This big group is eventually going to narrow down to someone being in charge of the schools. And that's the really ticklish proposition right now, because who's that going to be? It can't be a political figure. If it's the mayor, for example, and Duggan wants no part of this, but if it is the mayor, then the charter school people are going to be terrified that they're going to be shut out because the unions have such political influence in this city. You know, there are logistic problems that need to be solved. We've got to figure out how to locate schools so you don't have a big cluster over here and then over here none. You got to figure out transportation. There are quality schools in this city that kids can't get to because they don't have transportation. And you have to figure out enrollment. You can't have students and parents signing up for 5 different schools and then choosing one on opening day because the schools can't plan and they can't staff. And that's what's happening today.
But you say that is not a job then for Mike Duggan or the mayor to run this. But when you're talking about clustering where schools are going to be located, when you're talking about transportation, to me that also factors into what the city is going to look like in terms of neighborhoods and transportation.
Yeah, you've got to have a single authority to decide these things, and that's the problem. You have three different systems of public schools operating in Detroit. That doesn't make any sense. DPS, EAA, and the charter schools all have to work together and under one authority. And that's going to be controversial because the charter schools don't want any authority over them, but they are part of the problem. They are not enough of the solution. So, and I think it does make sense to put it under the mayor's authority in some way. I don't think the mayor should run the schools. I think he should have appointees to some sort of authority that then hires a chancellor who manages all this stuff. That's a model that some other cities have had, but you got to put it somewhere.
There has to be additional layer of safeguards to keep the politics out of it. You can't have the Detroit Federation of Teachers running these schools, and depending on which mayor is elected, that could easily happen. You can't limit choice when you have such poorly performing public schools.
Are you ready to say that the emergency management system is not a viable option for the Detroit Public School District?
Well, I think it's problematic with schools, right? The very first emergency manager, of course, now I'm going to forget his name.
Burnley.
Robert Bob.
Bob followed Burnley.
Bob followed Burnley, right. Yeah. Once said to me, he said, you know, the problem with the emergency management model in schools is that there is no lever you can pull to increase revenue. There's no way to get more money into a school district without getting more kids. And so in a situation like Detroit, where you are losing kids, you are just losing money, and so you're just always trying to pare the system down to match the number of kids. It's not a model for fixing it.
And maybe we move beyond thinking about a school system. Maybe we look more at a New Orleans model where you have individual schools that are basically independent, and there's some efficiencies of scales in the central district in terms of purchasing and what have you, but there's a lot of independence in the individual schools, and parents choose. And, you know, schools are getting better there. Schools are getting better in other states, and they're not getting better here.
All right, but you're talking about balance sheets, you're talking about buildings, you're talking about transportation, and not yet have we talked about what's actually happening in the classrooms of these schools, because of the test scores are so poor, the literacy rates are poor as well. So when kids are even graduating, they're not even ready to take on jobs, let alone go to college.
Right. Well, I mean, it is a pretty bleak picture in terms of outcomes in Detroit, and that's true across the board. They are slightly better in the charter schools, but even those results are not where we should be. I will say that DPS, you know, quietly, while this emergency management has taken place over the last 5 years, has had a good deal of stability that it had not had before. We've now had a superintendent, I think, for 4 years. 4 or 5 years. That's a record in the modern era for DPS in terms of tenure. So you've got one educational system in place, one curriculum that's been in place for a while, and they are starting to move the needle. I mean, they're starting to see some results from that. Now, of course, it's not miraculous overnight. Oh, all the kids are better, but it's the kind of progress that you want to build on, not destroy and start over.
But it does start with the classroom. I mean, it starts with the classroom. You've got to hire good teachers, you got to pay them what they're worth, and you got to hold them accountable. And you have to break them away from this union school district constant confrontation. Everybody's got to be focused on what's going on in that classroom.
Real quick, before we leave this topic, I'm concerned about a timeline. I know the governor wants to have something in place in the next 6 months, obviously to a year, but we need to move quickly on this. What is an actual reasonable timeline for something like that?
Well, I mean, the governor said to me earlier this week that he wants to respect the process that this committee is going through, and I guess that's a 4-month window. I know that's around the time that I think he and the mayor were planning to try to take something to the legislature anyway to redo it. So I think sometime in the middle of the year we'll start to see what this is going to look like. Getting it through whatever legislation you might need to do it might take a little longer.
Last word on this, Noel.
Well, how many more children are you going to fail? I mean, you don't have a lot of time. Every year that passes and we don't get this right is another year's worth of students who walk out of those schools, either drop out or walk out unprepared for productive lives. This is not something we have a lot of time to fix.